So thanks for coming. You may be curious why American Family Project, with its motto, "A Voice for the Family on Capitol Hill," is interested in an almost unknown writer from the 19th century. Last fall, we held a lecture series, The Constitution and the Family, and my conclusion was that Orestes Brownson best situates the family and the U.S. Constitution within the same divine plan for creation, the divine idea, as Brownson put it. He steadfastly sought the truth, and in his late 30s, now a transcendentalist, he realized that in his confidence in human perfectibility and determination to establish the kingdom of God on earth, he had fallen into pantheism. But a perfect society alone is not worthy of worship, so he concluded that there was no God and no purpose to life. God is completely other than creation, and 25 years after emerging from his atheism, Brownson was seeing all of reality rooted in the divine idea, God's creative act that brought the universe out of nothing. Not a nothing from something as we create, but from a nothing that was nothing. Brownson wrote, "Man is a dependent being, and neither does nor can suffice for himself. He lives not in himself, but lives and moves and has his being in God. He exists, develops, and fulfills his existence only by communion with God, through which he participates in the divine being and life." Brownson held that the person communes with God through three necessities of human nature. One is worship. Religion binds man to God as first cause, the cause of our existence, and carries him onward to God as final cause, the purpose of our existence being eternal happiness with God. Man communicates with God through the material world, which gets into the whole area of property. We commune with God through what we possess personally and through what we possess commonly. The planet, the environment, that sort of thing. And then third, the person communes with God through his own kind. The communion of man with God through dealing with other men and women, so society. The family being the basic building block of society, and then leading to all the other societies. But society does not and cannot exist without some sort of government. And Brownson writes, "As society is necessary of man's nature, so is government a necessity of society." Parents, getting back to the family, parents participate in the divine being and life, as Brownson put it, by raising their children in accordance with the divine idea for the family. And politicians participate in the divine being and life by governing according to the divine idea. Government, Brownson writes, contributes as a powerful means to the fulfillment by man of the divine purpose of his existence. Brownson identified two forms of government: the barbaric, which constrains the person's ability to commune with God through society, and the civilized, which encourages communion with God. After studying the history of governments, he concluded that the U.S. Constitution is not simply of human origin and allows the most civilized government ever known. He wrote, "I cannot conceive a more profoundly philosophic or more admirably devised constitution than that of our own government." So our speakers will take it from there. Richard Reinsch is the editor of Seeking the Truth, an Orestes Brownson anthology, and the author with the late Peter Lawler of A Constitution in Full, Recovering the Unwritten Foundation of American Liberty. He's currently editor-in-chief and director of publications for the American Institute for Economic Research, and a senior writer at Law and Liberty. Elliot Bartke is Emeritus Professor of Political Science, Purdue University, Fort Wayne. He is the author with Stephen Krauss of Orestes Brownson on the Democratic Principle and the 14th Amendment. For 20 years, Mr. Bartke lectured in the Great Books program at the University of Notre Dame, one great book being Brownson's masterwork, The American Republic. Finally, Robert Moffat has a doctorate in political science from the University of Arizona, and he explored the constitutional theory of Orestes Brownson. His essays on Brownson have appeared on Heritage Foundation's website and in the Catholic Historical Review, Modern Age, Law and Liberty, and Perspectives on Political Science. He's currently Senior Research Fellow in the Center for Health and Welfare Policy at the Heritage Foundation, specializing in healthcare and entitlement programs, especially Medicare. So, Richard, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Tom, thank you for the invitation and for putting this event together. It's always good to talk about Orestes Brownson, or as I say, the unjustly neglected Orestes Brownson. So why should you care about Brownson? And I think that reduces to one question, I think. What is America's actual constitution? So I think currently we're laboring under three constitutions. We've got the Founders' Constitution, we've got the Progressive Constitution, and you can think of it as a third constitution, but it's also, I think, at least dialectically related to the Progressive Constitution, and that's the hyper-liberal Constitution as well. Brownson confronts something rather dramatic. He confronts the Civil War. And during that war, he loses two sons who fought on the Union side. He had been engaged publicly in a lot of essays about slavery and the Constitution, about the expansion of slavery into the territories. What could the Constitution require? One biographer says that he visited with Abraham Lincoln in the White House, urging him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation much earlier as a war-fighting effort. So this meant a lot to him. And while we have not lost a substantial portion of the male population to fighting, as Brownson observed, he comes to grips with this tragedy. And his book, published in 1865, The American Republic, which he says is his most mature work of political reflection. So Brownson's writings number something like 20 volumes, each volume over 200,000 words. He, just incredible human being and his ability to work, write, and research. So in the American Republic, he confronts what he says is the real meaning of our Constitution. And he comes to an interesting conclusion, I think, if you think about the Civil War and as we understand it. He says the Republic came apart because those statesmen at the time, and for many decades preceding the Civil War, didn't understand the true nature of our Constitution. They had reduced it to, he says, starting in 1825, to pure democracy. That is pure majoritarianism, trying to stand on top of each other to get power and then to inflict pain on your opponents. That had become, he said, the received wisdom. He also says it had been reduced to individual rights alone and not the full Republican dimension of what we had received from the founding and from our history. And he also articulates these ideas, not necessarily in Aristotelian language or Thomistic language, but it's hard for me to think about Brownson as someone, and as, when Brownson kind of leaves the left in 1840, becomes a convert to Roman Catholicism in 1844, that's when he begins his education over again. And one of the first books he says he reads is Aristotle's Politics. And he's also very well versed in Aquinas. The common law is a huge part of his learning as well. And so he brings this to bear. So he speaks about politics, I think, in a very Aristotelian, Thomistic manner. And he says that we're going to think about American constitutionalism. We've also got to think about these great contraries that are within the constitutional order. So we've got tremendous national power, yet the power of the states. We've got to synthesize that and think through that. We've got a republic about individual rights, but also the just authority of the government. We need to think about that. We've got separation of powers. What's the full truth there? We've got social contract. This is also, he says, a problem. Not that he rejects the Declaration, but understanding the Declaration in pure modern social contract terms, he thinks is deeply problematic. Sort of like Alexis de Tocqueville in that regard. So he wants to put these things together. And in putting those together, he says, how can we become a constitutional people again? And he has really two foundational ideas in that regard. And one of those is, he calls it the providential constitution or the unwritten constitution. And then also another idea, territorial democracy. And I thought I might just walk through those and then sort of ask the question, because he says this is the way back to the founders' constitution. This is what we have to recover, this understanding. You can have a written constitution, and we do, but it ultimately has to be felt and lived by the people in terms that are unwritten. And so when I say the providential constitution, Brownson isn't necessarily talking about divine intervention in history that you can identify. But what he is saying is that the providential constitution is America situated, has the culmination of Western constitutional thought and practice. That is to say, all of the freedoms and the ways in which men and women in the West have understood themselves as constitutional people comes together collectively in our experience. So when we think about this, Brownson grounds our written constitution not in the service of abstract natural rights or autonomous individualism, but in the providential constitution. And what he's saying there is the written constitution cannot emerge from nowhere. It couldn't just emerge from the creation alone of statesmen's minds. It's going to be dependent upon the various givens that will limit and direct what is possible for statesmen at a particular time. And the givens that shape the written constitution are not oppressive constraints, they're civilizational accomplishments, Brownson says, that will make the written constitution possible. So providential, in this sense, means to be guided by what one is given, by custom, tradition, philosophy, theology, and prior political experience. So to comprehend the guarantees of American constitutionalism requires the incorporation of its unwritten constitution as both historical and a philosophical articulation of the meaning of the written constitutional order. To quote him, there must be, for every state or nation, a constitution, anterior to the constitution which the nation gives itself, and from which the one it gives itself derives all its vitality and legal force, end quote. The constitution of the state is given to a people who constitute a republic in a particular territory or geographically delimited place in the world. The unwritten constitution is found in a people's political culture, mores, customs, disposition, and peculiar talents. The constitution of the government is built on this assembly of order and connected to it forever. So the authoritative law of a particular country can't be viewed outside the context of the unwritten constitution. No government that is built to stand the test of time can be a merely willful construction that defies the historical, spiritual, and cultural materials that have been given to a people. So keep that in mind as we think about the progressive constitution. The unwritten constitution grounds the written constitution by limiting the range of potentialities it can develop and manifest. These limits also provide reasons for affirmation of an architecture of devotion to a country's actual constitution, its way of life. So this particular or political way of thinking recaptures something of the Greek polis, but with the Christian addition that each of us is more than a citizen through our relational devotion as creatures to the church. The American Republic is also to be distinguished from the tribe in its devotion to a common good that's much more than collective selfishness. And the American idea of the Providential Constitution places our particular country under the universal, yet still relational and personal God. And I think Tom was sort of hinting at this, something that's crucial for Brownson in leaving sort of liberation Protestant theology. Is he comes to this understanding very clearly that God is free. And God is free, and God is personal, God is relational. And that necessarily informs his own understanding of who he is as a human person and his own freedom. And man being sort of a singular exception within an otherwise natural clockwork universe. And he starts to understand what freedom is, where it comes from, what it's grounded in, and what its purposes are, and that man's personality, the best understanding for that is going to be that it actually finds its best image in God, who is relational and personal. So this sort of wipes the slate clean of thinking you're going to reform the world with sort of a Gnostic socialist idea. America's written constitution, and we think about it, the unwritten order, Brownson says it's the common law heritage, which is throughout the United States Constitution. The colonist practice of self-government for 150 years prior to the Declaration. Religious pluralism. The colonies as separate and then unified political actors in war. Brownson says the Articles of Confederation failed because it was an immature political document. It was a wartime document that didn't actually reflect the unwritten constitutional order of the people, and that fuller political articulation happens in the Constitution. We also have immigration patterns into a democratic society. And so these immigration patterns, already you're seeing an assimilation pattern take place that is, obviously non-hierarchic and obviously given over to a society of work, of effort, of achievement in that regard. Colonial resistance to and gained independence from an empire that had abused historic common law rights and its own tradition of limited government. So the legacy of the revolution and what it was fought for and what it was fought to do. Our framers, Brownson says, built as statesmen. And as such, they drew from all the sources that history, philosophy, political precedent, religion, and the rest of our civilization had given them. So also, if you think about the terms that I've just listed, they require balance, articulation, deliberation, and compromise within Republican government. The Providential Constitution requires that, deliberation and judgment about the means to make possible republicanism. What is religious pluralism? What does that mean at a certain point in time? What does federalism mean precisely for the national government, state and local governments? What about the common law tradition? How should that shape constitutional and economic freedoms? What about the tradition of limited government itself? What does it mean as we continue to govern ourselves? And so, my co-author, Peter Lawler, great scholar of Orestes Brownson, he uncovered, one example of this would be the debate over the Declaration of Independence. Inside both Jefferson's draft and then the Continental Congress debating it. And there's tremendous movement back and forth. One of the things that happens is Jefferson's nature's God, or the God of the Enlightenment, the God of the philosophers, is complemented through legislative deliberation with the God of the Christians, or the providential God, the personal God who comes in with two mentions at the end of the document. That's legislative deliberation, making space for everyone, making a much broader space and a much fuller articulation of citizenship than either party could have achieved on its own. That's an aspect of our heritage that we have to develop. Providential Constitution, constitutionalism, in one sense, means bringing together in one comprehensive self-understanding the partial truth of all the human understandings of freedom that have been discovered in the history of the West. In Bronson's eyes, taking responsibility for the American Republic is in the service of the truthfully differentiated dimension of the free and relational person. This relational person with economic, familial, political, and religious dimensions to his being is more truthfully differentiated than the ideological depictions of individuals who either understand themselves solely as a part of some social or political order, or as sovereigns or self-sufficient individuals who proclaim their rights at the expense of any obligations they might owe to others around them. The privilege of liberty, if we take Brownson seriously, cannot be divorced from relational responsibilities because no individual flourishing occurs outside of a relational context. Complementing the unwritten Constitution is the notion of territorial democracy that Brownson recommends as the modern political temptation of either hypercentralization or excessive individualism. Territorial democracy is Bronson's way of expressing what is the irreducibly Republican dimension of every free political order. Political loyalty pertains to the way of life shared by a particular people, occupying a particular part of the world. The idea of natural rights, if stressed to the detriment of obligations, as so many contend, makes the very idea of legal borders seem unjust. Free individuals should be directly open to each other in an unmediated marketplace, freed up from the rent-seeking of political force and fraud. But the truth is that we embodied beings necessarily find ourselves at home in particular places, and even natural rights to become effective have to be secured by a particular order. Political order, Brownson adds, is ultimately about justice, a good that is shared in common, as opposed to the selfish loyalties demanded by tribes, tyrants, and dislocated individuals. Brownson dismisses from Republican government abstractions like the sovereignty of society or of individuals creating government from a putative state of nature, making government an artificial rather than a natural institution that flows from man's sociability. Power, Brownson responds, is a public trust, not a form of obedience to either majoritarian suppression of particular liberties or to the endless rights claims lodged by autonomous individuals against society. Instead, it is ordered to the demands of a shared political enterprise that emerges from man's social nature. The freedom of the person that territorial democracy supports accounts for the richness of personhood, as seen in man's spiritual, political, familial, and economic relations, which must be supported and protected by the authority of the state. Brownson says that a good polity will connect and reconcile the free and relational person with self-government and law, and thereby engender devotion to the common good. Citizens occupying a particular part of the world, joined together by borders, law, and defined accountability of rulers to ruled, is what makes Republican government possible. So Bronson's territorial democracy as a political order is not open to ongoing redefinition by majorities, nor is it created purely by consent. Principles of popular sovereignty, equality, and majority rule operate within the context of territorial democracy. One way of thinking about this, practically speaking, is if you go back and you think about the Brexit debate in 2016, the case made by exit or by leave was we have a country, we have a history, we have a republic, we have our system of law, our culture, and our borders. And it's good. And we know what our obligations are here. But that is constantly threatened, constantly subject to redefinition by endless expansion of an open borders regime that we're in with the European Union. And it's not just migration, it's also law, it's ongoing commerce that we may or may not want, or what have you. Well, we want to get some control over the situation and become England again, or at least an England defined by British representatives who are directly accountable under law in this country to citizens. So that's, if you're kind of like puzzling and maybe my presentation was too abstract, that's a way to think about it. It's also, I think, a way to think about what's going on within a lot of the member states of the EU right now. They also are wanting, although they might not express it as such, as territorial democracy. The term itself comes from former British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. So what happens if we lose our providential constitution and territorial democracy? What constitutions do we get in turn? So one would be, I think, the progressive constitution that has been engaged now for over a century to redefine our constitutional order, succeeding in various ways, but of course, not yet fully. And so we kind of know what the progressive constitution is, right? I think a foundational disagreement with the founders' constitution. Woodrow Wilson, right, assume a fictitious national unity that exists. Why does it not exist? Woodrow Wilson says, well, because of a lot of private interest and because of divided and separated government. We don't know where accountability is. We have no effective centralized power. We have a lot of corporate interest. We have local interest. We have federalism. We have a lot of religion. We have all of these sorts of things working throughout the country. We need a very powerful, consolidated central government to recreate this unity broken by an ill-defined constitution. So we'll remake the constitutional order. And then most of that power is really going to be lodged in the executive branch, right? The idea of judicial review and things that happened in this country in the mid-20th century, I think, came along as something of a surprise, as an ongoing project of progressivism dialectically, rearticulating itself. We all need to, as Yuval Levin's wonderful new book, American Covenant, he says the progressives are really the first integralists, if you follow this kind of intra-Catholic debate we've been having the past 10 years. Why are they the first integralists? Because we're all supposed to think and act in the same way. That's Woodrow Wilson. But how's the progressive constitution going? Relatedly, we have the hyper-individualist or hyper-liberal constitution. This is the constitution similarly leaves no room for states to govern themselves, certainly not in any countercultural sense of enforcing moral regulations regarding abortion, family, religion, pornography. Why? Because all we have in politics is contracting and consenting individuals who have no real inbuilt limits and contents to their choices. This is a constitution that provides individuals a wide berth of freedom via natural rights that are in the 9th Amendment, that are incorporated in the 14th Amendment against states and localities. And it all seems very American, and this embodiment of liberal thinking about rights. This Constitution is devised solely in the interest of the rights of individuals based on the unrealistic abstraction of unrelated, autonomous individuals, divorced from the privileges and responsibilities of parenthood, of being creatures, of being citizens. So this type of constitutionalism, I would argue, isn't political enough, if we think about Bronson's categories, to be the foundation of any government. And it isn't relational enough to properly articulate the limits of government with the family or religion in mind. And ultimately, the goal is to reconfigure every feature of human life by an individualism that pushes us in the direction of what Pierre Monod, the French political theorist, calls a post-political, post-familial, and post-religious fantasy world that would make republicanism unsustainable. We also have emerging arguments for a post-liberal constitution, primarily founded by what I call kind of Catholic rejectionists of the American founding. They share tremendous commonality with progressivism and the need to use power and to control it to forge national unity, and similarly argue that much of our American founding is just no good. It's rooted in a liberalism, and liberalism at any speed is decadent and individualistic. Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule, other voices very prominent in this regard. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Okay, so I won't. I think most of you probably are aware of kind of what's going on there. But just some concluding thoughts. The progressive constitution is running on fumes, it seems to me. Can we continue to live in the conditions of its political atheism, of incessant tax and spending, of a regulation that is incredibly heavy-handed, if not lawless. And if we continue in this vein, what happens? What happens to us as constitutional beings? What happens to us in our economic lives and also in our religious lives? And then there's ongoing question of what is the entitlement state doing to us in any conception of free citizenship, which is surely the worst effect of the welfare state. The hyper-individualistic Constitution seems also, to my mind, now, as I say, it's running out of speed. As Adam Smith said, there's a lot of ruin in a good nation, but social breakdown seems manifest to me, so I don't know what that really builds on going forward. What I do think we have is truth of human nature, the way Brownson articulates it. We are relational, embodied persons who come to government with pre-political obligations that we have to fulfill to flourish. Government should not inhibit these, but should encourage them. So this means we are free for family, for religion, for economics, and for communities. This is what we might think of as a libertarian means for non-libertarian ends. So a policy program of large amounts of economic, educational freedom so that we can flourish, not as to be free for free's sake, but freedom in pre-liberal institutions. We also need to adopt a political belief that institutions matter and that our history as a Republican people matters. So we need to teach again and create the educational freedom to teach and learn again about our civilization and our country and our Constitution. Deliberation is also key here. A Republican people who wish to live free and responsible lives must talk, argue, and settle with one another in and through the institutions designed for the task. There is a reason why progressivism and hyperliberalism flourish in the judiciary and the administrative state. Ideology there can be imposed on top of citizens who disagree with it. So we need to restore the founders' constitution in another sense. And this also entails that we have to cease promoting or winking at a narcissistic and vacuous liberalism that does not create space for and exalt the relational person whose freedom has a rich and truthful set of ends and content. Thank you.
So as a political scientist, I have to do some survey research. So there are two questions I want to ask. Number one, how many of you have heard of Orestes Brownson before of this? Okay, so that's pretty good. So that's why you may be here. As you know, most people, if you mention Orestes Brownson, think you're a little bit weird. Right? Who is he? Right. But the other thing is, how many of you think that America is suffering terribly in its social and political order? Raise your hand. Okay, I think that's almost unanimous. Okay. Well, that's almost a dumb question because everybody from left to right knows that's true. But we're trying to suggest here is that the political thought of Orestes Brownson provides perhaps the best way to understand the current dilemma that we have. And it seems to me, and I can say this because I'm not a cardinal, is that as the Orthodox Jew here, I can say that I think one of the reasons that he is not so well known is because he's such a serious Catholic. And Catholics have suffered so much discrimination in American history, he's been left out. But his writing is as important as Alexis de Tocqueville, which people both on the left and right like to cite. And Richard did a terrific job, and also Tom's introduction, I want to thank them both, in introducing the thought, and I'm going to cover some of the same material, but perhaps in a different way to help understand why I think he's so important. Again, that he actually predicts a lot of the dilemmas that we have today, he says will happen. So what does he know? You have the same thing reading Alexis de Tocqueville. He talks in detail about the horrors of the welfare state in the 1830s. Well, what is Brownson doing? What does he understand that he's able to see where America will go with his understanding of the two constitutions? So I want to take a little bit of a different tack in talking about them because it's true, one Constitution, the written Constitution, is, for Brownson, the liberal Constitution, both in ideas, liberal ideas, and also in liberal institutions. And I want to make a difference between the liberal ideas and institutions established by the Constitution and Brownson's understanding of the providential Constitution. So yes, he does support the written Constitution and the liberal ideas and institutions, but he understands also the dangers of those institutions standing on their own. So what do I mean by that? So Richard did a terrific job outlining the problems of liberalism gone, let's say, crazy, where society is just autonomous individuals with no connection one to another. All right? So that's not classical liberalism quite. But Brownson understood that liberalism, Lockean liberalism, and the liberalism that's embraced by the founders, left to its own, would bring about the destruction of political order. So while he appreciates it and he's not anti-liberal as Patrick Neen and his buddies are, there's still a recognition of the dangers. So, for example, liberal, let's say, concepts and institutions, including separation of powers. Separation of powers is very important in our Constitution and for the purposes of establishing liberty. Checks and balances, federalism. But his understanding of the founders' understanding of checks and balances, separation of powers, and federalism is very, very different than the framers themselves. So federalism is very, very important, for example, in understanding what Richard again talked about as territorial democracy. If federalism is not as it's taught in political science classes for a long time, that it's different types of sovereignty competing with one another. That's not what it is. Federalism recognizes the distinction between the states and the federal governments in powers and responsibilities, but nevertheless, what's often missed is that they have a common purpose. So if you just think of federalism as powers, and distinct sovereignty, that becomes very dangerous for Brownson because it sets people against one another and it doesn't provide any common grounds. It has to have a common end and purpose. And so for Brownson, that common ground is provided by the providential Constitution. And I want to stress again, as Tom did in the beginning, and Richard is recognizing that, well, for one thing, from Brownson's perspective, we have to say every government is providential because every government is from God. That doesn't answer the question. So if you take, for example, Romans chapter 13, and some people who tend to be anti-Christian will turn it into something that it's anti-political or it justifies all kinds of tyranny, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and to God. So they're two different kingdoms and they never meet. That's not what it's all about. Because if every government is providential, it also has a responsibility and purpose. So for Brownson, and what the American Constitution does, together written and unwritten, better than any other, is to recognize that government has a providential origin, comes from God, but it also has a providential purpose. And in that sense, Brownson's understanding, let's say, of the two kingdoms is not, they should be collapsed or completely separate. We'll get back to that in a few minutes, but that political order has an important role as a mediary between the human and the divine. It's an intermediary. It brings the human and divine realms not completely together, but it creates this space, and the purpose for that is to elevate the souls of the citizenry. And this is very important because it's not just, again, the government is providential in origin and purpose, but because we understand that providence recognizes man's fallen nature whether it's original sin or the first sin or the id or libido gone crazy, whatever. Humans are humans. And humans have a bestial element. But humans also have a divine element. Sure, both. And this follows Aristotle, who's also read quite a bit of Plato as well, by the way. Very heavily influenced by Plato and Aristotle. And man is both beast and human. Whoever doesn't recognize it doesn't understand not only the nature of God's creation, but doesn't understand human nature. And it always strikes me how much that who people often deny that there is a God also deny the base part of our nature. So it's a curious thing. It doesn't have to be that way, but it often is. They seem to go together. So the purpose of government then is to elevate the souls of the citizen, recognizing that we need institutions that bring us together towards a higher purpose. Now, having said that, I want to talk a little bit more about his criticism of the written Constitution and what he thinks is necessary for America to succeed with the unwritten Constitution. And to do that, I think it might be important for me to talk about the different types of democracy that he understood was unfolding. And this is especially after the Civil War. It's becoming more apparent once the Civil War was over. And one of the best things he wrote was, it's actually an article aimed at Catholic youth. It's called The Democratic Principle. It's a brilliant piece. And in reflecting on the past and where America was headed, one of the things that Brownson does is to distinguish between what he calls humanitarian democracy, personal democracy, and then providential or territorial democracy. And he says, very interesting twist. He says even John Calhoun, who is one of his famous favorite writers, John Calhoun accepted personal democracy, individualistic liberal democracy, based on social contract theory. So even concurrent majorities doesn't overcome the problem that's inherent in liberal ideas, because what the liberals don't understand, given human nature, is that left to our own devices and our idea of liberty becomes liberty to do that which we want to do. Like my dog, who at 16 years old is now relieving himself all over the house, right? So that may be a metaphor for the country right now, but I don't think we're aging that fast, but in any case, that's what liberalism will become. But unlike Patrick Deneen of Vermeulen and some of the others, the problem isn't liberalism. The problem is democracy. And Patrick Deneen wants to defend democracy against liberalism, but liberalism is not the problem insofar it's the root of the problem. The root of the problem is human nature, and the root of the problem, therefore, is democracy that's a radical democracy. And this is coming from a person, Brownson defends democracy. But liberal democracy itself can't stand. And the reason it can't stand, because looking at the Civil War, he said, what is the Civil War? The Civil War is a battle of interests. And the North is going to win because they've got the power. And what's happened to Congress after the Civil War, and the executive branch as well, is that it's a battle of interests. It's a battle of liberal ideas, but liberal ideas reduced to the lowest common denominator, which is self-interest. So people are, this wouldn't happen today, of course, but Congress is being taken over by people whose interests are self-aggrandizement and money or fame, whatever it is that turns them on. So personal democracy says dangerous, but more dangerous is humanitarian democracy. Because humanitarian democracy doesn't focus on us as individuals, the way that personal democracy does, but humanitarian democracy looks at humans as abstractions, not as individuals, not as particular people. And so what's happening as he's witnessing this is that humanitarian democracy is establishing ideas and rhetoric that will lead to the growth of government, a socialist government, he's saying this in the 1870s already, that will seek to provide the solutions to all mankind, right? Because humans are not individuals, they're an idea. And we see injustice, and Richard talked about this already too, that we're just going to impose an abstract solution on abstract human beings. And that's what he feels is really one of the great dangers now. But in both cases, which seem to be opposite, humanitarian versus personal democracy, one going back to the individual separated from all other individuals, the other talking about increasing the power of government, they're both flip sides of the exact same coin. That is, it's egalitarianism gone crazy. So, Brownson himself is a great believer in democracy, in an Aristotelian or Platonic sense, that is, democracy well educated to its proper end. So he's not against democracy, per se. What he argues is that for the democracy to succeed, that the concept of liberty and equality must be understood in its proper sense. And for that, you need not only the written Constitution, but the providential Constitution, where political order, again, is an intermediary between the human and the divine, elevating the souls of the citizenry. So how does that happen? And what I want to talk about now a little bit is our political culture, which we all know is fractured, dangerously fractured. So this affects every one of us in this room. With our own families, our neighborhoods, things seem to be collapsing in ways that he talks about. Why? So the family, for example, where Tom's project on Narron Family Project is very, very important. And sometimes we think of speaking of the family in relation to the government as keeping the government out of family. Now, I'm sympathetic to that. But the real point for Brownson is that the family is essential for the well-being of the government. Strong families are where individuals learn justice, compassion, because justice requires a recognition of your own limitations and sharing with others. If you don't learn to share and limit your desires, which people learn in the family, and it's also very, very clear that the single most important factor in people rising out of poverty is two-parent families. Now, one might think that's just an economic message to say that, but it's more than that. There's something that people learn in families. It's learned in single-parent families too. I have plenty of examples of that. But as a rule, we see that as a way of getting out of poverty. But the more important point there is that a family should not be understood in the sense of it's government against the family or the family against the government, but that it's a relationship where one requires the other in order to fulfill the proper role, not only of the family, but Republican government. Similarly, private property. He's a great defender of private property, but he's also a great critic of private property from his early writing years when he's still a transcendentalist and a hardcore Democrat to his last years. Why? Because private property should not be understood in a liberal sense alone, that it's mine. You know, one of the interesting things in John Locke, what makes my property mine is my work, which in the Bible is a punishment for sin. Locke somehow turns it into the great virtue of life. Now, it's not that work is bad and property is bad. Quite to the contrary. They're important, but it's a trust from God. whatever we have for Brownson is a trust from God. That doesn't mean government can take it, whether it's local, state, or federal. It's not so simple. But government and property must understand that the importance of property is not just its mine. For example, the great 1765 statement, no taxation without representation. That's just that it's my money, so you can't take it. No, if I participate in the making of law that results in taxation, then it's legitimate. But I have to participate in the making of it, which most of us don't do. Or it seems completely removed from us, as is government completely removed in so many ways. So for Brownson, again, family, property, these institutions of the private order must be maintained, not just for the self, but for the community and for the safety and health, well-being of the republic. Same thing with communities in location, in territory. Brownson asked the question, well, we can change it a little bit here. If you ask somebody, where's my hometown? The answer is the place I no longer live. That's my hometown, right? There's that disconnect. Or people will move every 7 years or whatever it is, for what purpose? Economic advancement. And the IRS will give you a tax deduction for moving for a job, but they don't give you a tax deduction for staying in the same place for 7 years. Why wouldn't they do that if you want to promote healthy communities? Right? Well, because we don't think like that. For Brownson, again, location, place is essential for promoting the interrelationships, again, that Richard was talking about. And so if you don't understand it from this perspective, this providential perspective, which again, not just God created and the purpose and origin of government is providential, but they're in the institutions of life. It's providential. And if we it's not just taking God out of the Constitution or God out of the public order. It's like, people often say, I'm a believer. Well, what do you do about it? It requires something from you. And for Brownson, that is essential. So the liberal Constitution, the liberal order, cannot sustain itself over time. It requires this different understanding that's not an abstract understanding, but rooted in family, property, community, etc. Okay. Now, what I want to lay it out like that, a little bit differently than Richard had done, because I want to talk about how that applies perhaps today to understanding constitutionalism, taking a slightly different tack. I'm going to repeat some of the concepts that were brought up before, but one of the arguments is, and I'm very sympathetic to it, is that the future of American constitutionalism depends on going back to the appropriate liberal ideas that informed from the founders through a significant portion of American history that's lost because of the new liberalism, the new progressivism, etc. So we've got to go back to the new liberalism, the old liberalism. The problem with that, from Brownson's perspective, is that liberals who call for that don't ask how we got here. Well, it's not fair to say that, because they do. They'll say, it was the Great Society that changed liberalism. And that's true. It was the New Deal that changed liberalism. It was taking away from state legislators the right to elect senators. And we can go on and on and on and on. So there are ways to see changes in our idea of liberalism to progressivism, but one has to ask why. Why has this happened? And Brownson, again, suggests that this will happen because you still have to address those institutions of society that make freedom and justice possible, as Brownson understands it. And having worked with some state legislators, who believe in freedom and property, I'm often puzzled by their complete lack of understanding of the issue. I once said to the chair of a Senate Education Committee in a state that will go unnamed that we need to introduce into the educational curriculum some sense of the American political and even Western tradition. We've got to have serious classes. We teach these texts. And he said to me, "You're right. I'm thinking about instituting a required class on entrepreneurialism." I realized we had to finish the conversation. But this kind of thing happens quite a bit. So the problem with just going back to liberalism is that I don't think it's going to happen, and I don't think it addresses the fundamental principles on its own. The second approach is the one again mentioned about the integralism, or the movement where the state should be subordinate to Catholic teaching and Catholic authority. They tried that in France in the early 20th century, and one of the ways some of those leaders were characterized before they almost died and reverted back to it, is that they were Catholics without faith, monarchists, Catholics without faith. And I'm not saying these people don't have faith, some of them I know, and they're good people, but the problem, again, isn't liberalism. They don't ask the question. The problem is, for Brownson, democracy. It's human nature. You can't throw out don't throw out the written Constitution. It's problematic. That's true. But it's precious. And it's part of the reason that America can be a republic, an important part, half the part at least, of why it is. But democracy is the problem. So don't defend democracy unless you understand both the dangers and the possibilities and what political order requires to educate the democratic soul. Okay? So Brownson would reject both the liberal, that type of integrationist that wants to raise religion to something that it's not capable of doing in the country. And then the third one, am I almost out of time here, or what we go? Okay, so the third one is, I don't want to criticize John Courtney Murray too much because I like him a lot, but the happy marriage of the liberal and religious tradition, they're complementary, but it's not a happy marriage in the sense that, everything's going to be fine. Because the point is, for Brownson, is that, yes, there's an unwritten and a written Constitution, and they're both essential to our well-being, but there is a tension. There's an important tension. Don't think that they're going to go together so well. Understand all the damage that liberalism can do, and the damage even religion can do. But there's all kinds of different religious beliefs, and Brownson's very critical of some of them, right? And again, it's not this religion or that religion, it's the idea of the institutions of political order working towards its providential end by bringing people together. So I think Brownson is very important for pointing the way to understanding the future of constitutionalism in America today. And one of the things is that if you're here and you know Orestes Brownson, one of the most important things that we can all do is the way we treat our friends, our families, our communities, the way we're involved, right? Because the education starts in our own souls, in our own families, in our own communities, in our own schools. All of that's very, very important. We have a lot more we could say about it, but I best stop. So,
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I got the unenviable job of being the anchor man for this, but in the time that we have left, I want to emphasize, I think, some practical recommendations based on some of the discussion we've had so far. I would say, first of all, I want to thank Tom and my colleagues for having this seminar. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote the first great biography of Orestes Brownson in 1939 called The Pilgrim's Progress. And in the final chapter, he said that Orestes Brownson is largely unknown for a lot of different reasons. One, as he pointed out, was that in the 19th century, Catholicism was very unpopular in America, and that the fact that Brownson became a Roman Catholic excommunicated him from polite society and so many other areas. It's just a fact. It's just the reality. Our history in America is not necessarily one, as we all know, of religious or racial tolerance. That's just the truth. However, he was prophetic in so many ways. And what I thought one of Schlesinger's great paragraphs in the end of his book was that, in fact, if you read Orestes Brownson on so many different things, philosophy, theology, religion, literary criticism, political theory, he actually said, Schlesinger, as a social critic and as a philosopher, there was no American of the 19th century who was his equal. None. Schlesinger, the speechwriter for Jack Kennedy, one of the leading liberal historians of the 20th century. By the way, that book, The Pilgrim's Progress, became the foundation of Schlesinger's great work, The Age of Jackson, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. Anyway, as kind of the end game here for me, what I want to talk about is federalism, and I'm going to make some practical recommendations based on the vision of Orestes Brownson. And I will start out by saying that everybody in this room, every American, is heir to an innovative achievement in practical political science. Everybody in this room is a citizen who holds a unique dual citizenship, reflecting both the unity and the diversity of the American people. Every American is equally a citizen of the United States of America, the Great Republic, and a citizen of the state in which he has legal residence. Now, what does that mean? Well, on a practical level, it means that every elected official, federal or state, has a solemn duty to protect our rights as citizens of the United States, as federal citizens of the United States, but also as citizens of the states. Our relationship under the original Constitution, the relationship between the states and the federal government, is not a vertical relationship where the federal government's up here and the states are down below. The relationship in the original Constitution is a horizontal relationship. Under Article 6 of the federal Constitution, the national law is indeed supreme. But as Alexander Hamilton, probably the strongest nationalist at the Constitutional Convention, said, it is supreme within its own sphere of constitutional authority. Absorb that fact. It's not a vertical relationship. It's horizontal. Brownson emphasizes a major fact, and I think my colleagues, tried to elucidate this. Many Americans simply do not sufficiently appreciate our civic inheritance. I mean this. Throughout the entire course of the human history, the world never witnessed the adoption of a plan of self-government quite like the debate and deliberation leading to the adoption and ratification of the federal Constitution. Never happened. The Constitution of 1787 was the product of an extended, private debate on constitutional details in Philadelphia by American society's most august citizens, who then humbly subjected their work to an even more intense, extensive, and often raucous popular debate, and left the final decision in the hands of our citizens in specially called state conventions. So that great debate started top down, but it ended bottom up. In Europe, the political elites were astonished by this. We have written record on this, which is really quite rich. There's some wonderful books on the subject, but it was a marvel to many people overseas in France, Great Britain, Germany, Russia. That is what made the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 unique and the subsequent debates historic. That free, open, robust debate over the ratification of the Constitution, lasting for months, engaging Americans, the length and the breadth of the former colonies, was again the first such process of its kind. Orestes Brownson grasped that fact, and that insight became central to his own work in the elaboration of the American Constitution and the American Republic. That Constitution embodied two important facts: the unity of the American people and the diversity of the American people, what Richard Reich referred to as the unwritten Constitution. And Brownson writes, I think this is quite interesting, he says, America's written Constitution, the product of the Philadelphia Convention, is a true reflection of America's unwritten Constitution. Quote, "There is evidently a profound logic in the Constitution, and there is not a single provision in it that is arbitrary or anomalous or that does not harmonize dialectically with the whole and with the real Constitution of the American people." And then he goes on to say, the founders actually building on the unwritten Constitution, better, quote, better than they knew. The fundamental political tension of 1788 is actually not radically different from the fundamental political tensions of 2024. In 1788, the central issue in the former American colonies, the overriding fear of the anti-federalists is that the new Constitution would result in a concentration of power and the destruction of the independent political authority of the state. That threat actually remains today. For the founders, the concentration of power was almost universally recognized as a political evil. And the reason is that ultimately it would suppress personal, political, and economic liberty. Recall, once again, that the key charge against Britain's government leading up to the revolution in 1776 was that it was arbitrary government. The Declaration of Independence is, in fact, nothing more than a statement, a very elaborate statement of an attack, an indictment, a long indictment of arbitrary actions by the British Crown, and that arbitrary government was inherently tyrannical. In 2024, we're dealing actually with many of the same problems. The threat's taken a new form. It has been given a new life with the relentless rise of a huge, largely unaccountable system of regulatory and administrative control over millions of Americans' personal, economic, and even today, more so than ever before, their social lives through a very powerful administrative state. The internal conflicts intensify over fundamental moral and cultural issues, including the meaning and value of human life and even human sexuality. We have a Supreme Court justice asked a question under oath, "Please tell me what is a woman?" and she cannot answer the question. That was inconceivable not too long ago, right? Nobody ever thought that there would ever be a serious conversation about whether men could become pregnant. But that's the world in which we live. It's just an indication of the degree of intensity of our cultural conflicts, as well as the scope and the size of our fiscal obligations. Richard mentioned it, the massive entitlements that will impose huge pressures on current and future generations of taxpayers. Gen Z will not know what hit them. You saw the CBO report, right? You're all familiar with it. 2034, a $50 trillion national debt. Ponder it. Anyway, federalism was the constitutional remedy to balance these competing forces, the need for a strong and competent national government, and the desire to retain a strong and viable local government, and the political freedom to order and resolve our own local and domestic problems. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to get it right on federalism. This is something that is not abstract. This is not a political science issue. This is nothing to deal with political philosophy. It is something that deals with actually action in this building in the House and in the Senate and in the White House. We've got to get this right. Too many of us don't. Various people use the same language and mean very, very different and contradictory things. Progressives, we've talked a lot about progressives, obviously acknowledge there are 50 states, 50 different states, but since the early 20th century, they do not view them the way the founders did, or even the way most American governors of the state see themselves today. What do I mean by that? I guess I mean that progressives then and now often view the states as obstacles to progress or actual, on a positive level, actual or potential branch offices of the federal government. The most recent example of this on a massive scale was the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, what we call Obamacare, where the states are to become channels of federal regulatory power, basically agents of the Department of Health and Human Services. We have so-called state-based health insurance exchanges, which are really creations of the national government. The states have absolutely nothing to do with any of it. These are federal, not state, rules for health insurance. The states are supposed to cooperate and execute the rules and regulations daily churned out by the federal bureaucracy in Washington. Some of our conservative friends take a polar opposite extreme position. A few years ago, just mentioned this, I got an email from an irate conservative. They didn't like what I said about something. I don't know what it was exactly, but it was a few years ago. This probably was a Heritage Foundation donor because I'm at the Heritage Foundation. And he writes me angrily in an email, each of the 50 states is a nation state like France, Germany, or Spain, and not some sort of vague village, mini town, or township out in the countryside in North America or in the Pacific Ocean. Now, I get the writer's anger and frustration, but no, the states of New York, California, or Indiana do not have the same sovereign status as Britain, France, Russia, Spain, or Germany. I mean, this is insane. But it is not far removed from the political theory of the 19th century. On that crucial point, Orestes Brownson's insights were and are still very compelling. The question that Brownson wrestled with, and he argued that the founders actually did not wrestle with well enough, was the issue of sovereignty. Sovereignty is where the supreme power of the state actually rests. The sovereign is the supreme power of the state. Is the sovereign divisible? Well, many of the classical liberals who supported the Constitutional Convention said, well, yeah, sure, we'll divide sovereignty between the federal government and the state governments. That is to say that sovereignty is something that inheres in government. Well, it doesn't. The assumption must be, if you say, well, the states delegate the authority to the federal government, the assumption, must be that the principal, the individual state, somehow loans out its sovereignty to the agent, the national government, which is to act on its behalf. But logically, says Brownson, the agent is not and cannot logically be superior to the principal. So he concludes, any act of delegation freely given can also be freely withdrawn. Correct? It was John C. Calhoun, the brilliant John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, more than anyone else, who paved the theoretical path for state secession. The Constitution, in Calhoun's view, was nothing more than a compact among the states, as Calhoun held an agreement among sovereign states to deal with general and specific interests as they deemed proper. The states were sovereign. They themselves, individually, were the supreme units of the American political order. Before the compact, they were sovereign, and they were sovereign after the compact. But, as Brownson says, the sovereign states could only delegate the exercise of their sovereign powers, not the sovereign powers themselves. While Calhoun himself was no secessionist, state secession was nonetheless the logical conclusion to the premises of that argument. If a sovereign state equal in constitutional status with every other sovereign state can freely give consent, right? The principle of consent, then once again it can logically withdraw that consent. Nice, neat theoretical argument. consequence of the argument, of course, was a sea of blood in 1861. None of this is old. None of it's old. The nature of a union has been a historical flashpoint of debate for as long as the country's been around throughout our history. It's gone back and forth. Brownson's argument about sovereignty is basic. The states, in fact, were not independently sovereign. They did not act as sovereigns. That is the historical reality. Brownson clarifies the truth, that sovereignty, the supreme power of government, was transferred from the British Crown to the people of the United States, or the people of the states united. There was no union outside of the states, and there was no states outside of the union. The fact is, the United States, born in war and revolution, was an organic unity from the beginning. The people of the states, United States, in fact, were people in the states united, not separate. The nation existed as a fact prior to the Constitution established in Philadelphia. And in this, Brownson stands squarely on the shoulders of General George Washington and the Supreme Court Justice John Jay. Washington, in his last circular letter of 1783 to the Army, writes, he declares that the United States has come into existence as a nation, and in his farewell to the Army, he urges the soldiers to think of themselves henceforth as, quote, citizens of the United States and not just Virginians or New Englanders. Likewise, John Jay clarifies the fact in Federalist 5, the reality of the United States on the world stage. Quote, to all general purposes, we have been uniformly one people, each individual citizen, everywhere enjoying the same national rights and national privileges and protections. As a nation, we have made peace and war. As a nation, we have vanquished our common enemies. As a nation, we have formed alliances and made treaties and entered into various compacts and conventions with foreign states. The Constitution is a beautiful thing. It sets clear limitations on the power of the federal government. You all know that. And the founder's vision was that the vast majority of subjects would be regulated by state law. The question is, what do we do now? Can I take a couple minutes? These are my recommendations based on my understanding of Orestes Brownson's great work. Orestes Brownson is not here to tell us what to do, but he did outline a vision which I think could be the foundation of policy. Brownson neatly summarizes the historical mission of the United States. He says, quote, this is the providential mission of America. Its idea is liberty, indeed, but liberty with law and law with liberty. Yet its mission is not so much the realization of liberty as the realization of the true idea of the state, which secures at once the authority of the public and the freedom of the individual, the sovereignty of the people without social despotism, and individual freedom without anarchy. In other words, its mission is to bring out in its life the dialectic union of authority and liberty, of the natural rights of man and those of society. Now, what does that mean? Today, we are witnessing unthinkable transgressions against the constitutional order. Some have actually argued we're living in a post-constitutional age. You all know it, I'll just mention a few things. The refusal to enforce clear written immigration laws, the issuance of executive orders and dictates without any congressional authority backing them up, numerous and direct challenges to the legitimate authority of Congress to secure information what is necessary for Congress to continue or to fulfill its responsibility to exercise its legislative powers, violations of the First Amendment, violations of the Second Amendment, the Due Process Clause, among so many other things. We are in a deadly serious situation. And so what do we do? Well, first and foremost, and I don't know how many people are congressional staff here, but this would be directed to you and your boss. Take the oath to uphold the federal Constitution seriously. What does that mean? It's not as easy as it sounds. As a practical matter, it means that one should simply refuse to enact anything that is not clearly justifiable under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Period. As a matter of fact, what I'm suggesting is that Congress visibly reframe the debates on practical matters and measures within the confines of their constitutional responsibilities their constitutional responsibilities to interpret and apply the law. I heard one, I'm not going to mention his name, one member of the House in a hearing not too long ago say, well, look, this is a constitutional question. The courts will decide that. No. No. Constitutional interpretation has never been intended by the founders to be the exclusive prerogative of the courts. And anyone who says otherwise is simply ignorant. It's not a debatable matter. It's a hard task. I don't make light of it. Sometimes the determinations of what is or should be a matter for the general government is not always a simple question, but it's a question that must always be asked because one either upholds the Constitution or takes the oath to uphold the Constitution seriously, or one does not. Lawgivers are not technocrats. Congressional staff are not merely cogs in some legislative machine. They're called upon to think and think seriously about their responsibilities. I think sometimes the most serious failure is simply not to think about it at all. Secondly, members of Congress should actively cooperate with state legislatures on common concerns. Start working closely and cooperatively with state legislators back home on issues of domestic policy, energy, education, health, environmental policy, tax policy, whatever. For House members, it may very well mean regular correspondence or meetings with state legislators who have similar responsibilities and their own committee assignments in the state capitals. Whatever area of public policy today could be handled or should be devolved to the states rather than retained at the federal level, that should be an active conversation. Ronald Reagan, by the way, proffered rather dramatic devolutionary initiatives, returning power to the states. So did Bill Clinton, by the way, in some areas. So that would be a good thing, to start that conversation. With a shift of public responsibility, you have a shift in public debate. Since local government closest to the people, is the most democratic, as Jefferson argued very strenuously, the power shift would revitalize democratic debate at the local level where it is most important. Oh, here's another one. Make senators directly accountable to the states. The 17th Amendment certainly changed the way in which senators are appointed. A number of founders initially favored the Senate as a kind of a powerful Senate modeled on the Roman system with powers of appointment and budgetary powers and treaty powers. But one thing is the Senate was to be the ultimate federal institution in Washington. The senators were to represent the states. One way the states could actually do this is to make the senators more directly accountable, is to have the senators, to require the senators, to ask the senators to give an account of their stewardship of state interest at the beginning of every legislative session. It could take the form of an annual address to the state legislature at the beginning of their sessions, use forums to outline an agenda for representing the state in Washington, consulting with state elected representatives on matters of direct concern to the state. Point is, they are state representatives. They don't represent some mass. And we should start requiring them to act that way. Sue Washington when Washington gets out of the way. That's already happening. Put federal officials in the hot seat at the state level as well as the federal level. Here's my idea. In number 28 of the Federalist, Alexander Hamilton writes, "Projects of national usurpation," I love the line, "will be detected by state legislatures at the distance, and possessing all of the organs of civil power and the confidence of their people, they can adopt a regular plan of opposition." Well, here's one. Department of Commerce, Department of Health and Human Services, whatever. Want to issue a rule or regulation? Fine, that's great. Let them come down to Indianapolis or, Alabama or Annapolis, Maryland, and defend it. Now, state legislators can invite them. They might not come, but you would have a written record, and their invisibility would be a glaring, obvious thing. So that's something that I've been thinking about. Work cooperatively with other states. I could go into great detail on that, but I'm running short on time. I will say this. Because Washington's challenges to state authority is so extensive, I would hope that we would see the institutionalization of some kind of a red state coalition to coordinate both a public relations and a common policy response to the excesses of Washington. During the Trump administration, blue states like California routinely challenged the administration on a whole variety of issues. Red states should be encouraged to do the same and formalize their opposition through a new organization dedicated to that purpose. The groundwork for red state coalitions already been laid. I mean, it's already happening in many respects. In 2012, 26 states challenged the Affordable Care Act before the U.S. Supreme Court, and they scored a mixed success. They rolled back a massive expansion of Medicaid because it was unconstitutional. Well, anyway, 26 states getting together and doing something like that makes a lot of sense. The point is, the country is deeply polarized, and there's a world of difference between the citizens of the blue states and the red states. Vermonters do not see the world the same way as people in South Carolina. Texas and California, I've been to both, they might as well be on different planets. I mean, really true. But the source of the polarization, we are actually more diverse than ever. But the source of our polarization is not just one issue, like it was slavery, basically, but a whole wide range of issues. As I said earlier, moral, cultural, political, economic. Right now, too many Americans just simply don't like each other. And that's going to continue for some time. The last time we had such a polarization, back in the 1850s, the result was catastrophic. We have to learn, however, to live with one another, but the only way that can happen is if we refrain from using federal power as a sledgehammer of coercion and conformity on a wide variety of public policy questions where we cannot and will not come to an agreement. The original Constitution gives us a way out. We need to live and let live, and the best way to do that is to revive the federalism that the founders gave us and that Orestes Brownson defended so valiantly in the midst of the Civil War when he lost two of his own precious sons in defense of the Union. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I do want to announce that American Family Project, in order to promote the Brownsonian scholarship, is working on a program to have a Orestes Brownson senior thesis competition. And we have about 25 academics around the country who are sympathetic to this idea. So I think we will be able to reach a good number of students, even in our first year. We'll be working this out, and we'll be ready to announce it sometime in early fall. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope this was helpful for all of you. It was certainly helpful for me. Thank you.